believe I'm recording. So I'm Trevor Keyler. I'm going to be your lab instructor. I may also have you for the 325 lecture portion for one of the 4 blocks. So welcome. It's nice to meet you all. If you wouldn't mind, I think most of you have, but if you could mute since I'm recording, it'd be good. We'll get a cleaner recording for people who can't be here right now. We will be meeting at this time every Wednesday at 11:15, unless I email you. Otherwise, there may be a couple instances in which we have to do that. But I did send you an invite, a Zoom invite. It was a little goofy at first due to time zone things. So I think I've corrected it now. It should be at 11:15, but look at your time zone. Make sure that's correct. Oh, what else? Today, we're going to go through the axial skeleton. Next week, we'll go through appendicular skeleton. That's nice. We usually do histology, axial skeleton, and appendicular skeleton all at once during the semester, but now we get to break it up a little bit because we're going to be using the complete anatomy app, which I'll talk about shortly. So I'll go through axial. If you can save your questions to the end, that would be great. We got a little bit to go through here. And then if there is time at the end as well, I can answer specific complete anatomy questions, app-related stuff if you've had some issues. But I'll try to show you some tricks as we go through this as well today. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen with you, and we'll work through the introduction to the axial skeleton. I got a little PowerPoint here. So let's see here. Desktop 2. Okay, move this here. You can all see that still, I'm hoping. All right, so we'll move on. I'm gonna bust out a little pen here. I think this will be helpful. All right, so the axial skeleton is the part of the skeleton that consists of the bones of the head, and then the vertebral column, we see here, probably easier with a posterior view, and then we have the thoracic cage. As part of this vertebral column, we have the sacrum as well and the coccyx. Sacrum is made up of fused vertebrae. We'll talk about that shortly. So this is your axial skeleton. Here we have both an anterior and a posterior view. You're going to want to familiarize yourself with anatomical language. And it's actually, there's a little helpful bit in the last page of your textbook. You flip to the very back, and we have anatomical terms used to indicate direction and orientation. That's right here. That's helpful. I'll be using that type of anatomical language to describe the axial skeleton today as we go. So for example, we'll be using things like posterior versus anterior, right? So anterior is front, posterior is back. So here we have a front view and a posterior or back view of the axial skeleton. Superior versus inferior, so top or above versus bottom or below. Proximal versus distal. This is usually in reference to a point. So for example, you could say your wrist is more proximal to your elbow than would be a digit. That would be more distal because it's farther away from your elbow. And then we have lateral versus medial. Okay? When we're talking about that, medial would be closer to the midline, and something further away from this midline of the body we would say is more laterally located. Okay, so that's just some terminology that will be helpful. This image here is just breaking down how many bones are in the different part of the axial skeleton. So for example, we can see the skull or the head. We got 22 bones. 8 of those are the cranium and 14 of those are facial bones. And that's just kind of an FYI. I guess a little FYI for you, in a few instances, you may need to know which side of the body a bone comes from, right or left. And also, I guess, just an FYI, this is the right side of the body. So if you were to imagine yourself standing here, it's your right hand. So even though this hand here appears on the left for us, we're talking about this person's right hand. So this is right, and this is the left side of the body. I think a lot of you know that, but it's helpful to point out. So we'll start with the skull. And actually in New Science 110, I believe it is, there's a little study lab that we've set up for you. I think it's in the process of being unpacked, but in there we have some different skull models for you. But I guess the nice thing is, now that we have the Complete Anatomy app, you really don't need to go in there and kind of manipulate those models, because within Complete Anatomy, you can manipulate the skull or any of those bones right in the app. You can isolate different bones and look at them, and then look at the surfaces and parts of those bones as well. So let's look at some of these bones, I suppose. We'll dig in. And really today, I'm just going to be giving you tips and kind of ways to study this material. You have everything you need. You have the Complete Anatomy app. You have your list of structures. You have to be able to identify those. And it's not very helpful if I go through and just really point out every single structure you need to know, but I'll give you some tips on how to study perhaps. All right, so let's see. So I'm going to point out some of those terms from the last slide of your, oh, actually, you guys haven't seen this yet, so let me show you that. At the very last slide of this PowerPoint, which you can find on Canvas on the lab page, this is going to be particularly helpful. And here we have different bone terminology. And I posted this up on the lab Canvas page as well as a separate PDF file. And this is just going to help you with different, terminology associated with bones. So for example, here we have a condyle. You may see that word pop up in your structures list. And then this will help you just quickly define what a condyle is. It's a large, smooth, oval structure. Okay. So we'll be referencing this a couple times a day, and it's helpful to have even if you want to print it out. So when you're going through your structures list. So you can print that PDF right off of this PowerPoint or from the Canvas page. We put that up separately for you. All right, where was I? My pen back here. All right, so let's point out some of those as we go. So the first thing we have here is a supraorbital foramen. So supra, that means above. Orbital is relating to the eye. Here we have the orbital socket. And then foramen, if we flip to that table at the end of the PowerPoint, the bone terminology, we see that that is just a rounded passage through a bone. So it's a hole, okay? And that's exactly what we see right here. We have an above eye socket hole. We can just break down these names and their descriptors of what they are. So supraorbital foramen. And then kind of strange, on the other side here, the right side of this skull, we have a supraorbital notch. And I'm showing you this just to point out that there's interperson variability. Okay, so they're kind of showing both these features on one skull. If you feel the ridge of your eye, okay, of that socket, you can kind of maybe feel whether you're a notch or a foramen person. So I'm a notch person. Okay, I can feel that divot, and it's not a foramen in my case. But there is differences between individuals. There are, I should say. And even on some of those, we actually have human skulls that you can look at, and you'll see both notches and foramen on them as well. Okay. And a notch, you don't have to go to your descriptor. You know what a notch is. They don't have that on that bone terminology page. Also, I'll point out here we have a hyperlink. So Manny went in and put these in, and these are going to link to direct pages within your Complete Anatomy app, or slides, I should say. So Manny's prepared these. And if I get rid of my, get rid of my pen, we can click on that, and that hyperlink should bring us directly to Complete Anatomy, and it should bring up the bones of the skull for us. All right, are you seeing that complete anatomy app on that screen then? Cool. Okay. I should also point out that we may ask you about individual bones. So for example, and we could just show you one individual bone. We don't have to show you the whole skull. So while it is helpful to know the bone in reference to where other bones are, you will have to recognize them individually. So for example, if we look at the sphenoid bone here, okay, we could show you just the sphenoid bone. So there's the sphenoid bone, and we can see that you're going to be responsible for not only the bones that we can see externally, but those that are internal as well. And that's where complete anatomy really shines. We can isolate and see those internal bones like we typically can't. So again here, I want to walk through the sphenoid specifically because it is a little trickier, but we'll get an idea of some of our surfaces and parts that you need to know as well. Okay, so let's try this again. Get my mouse up here. Okay, we'll close this again. We're going to use this screen. And then we're going to click on the sphenoid and we're going to do hide others. Okay, and now we can see the individual parts and labels for the sphenoid bone, and we can still manipulate it here. And the sphenoid, we like to think of as kind of a bat. So maybe you can see that shape. We got these wings, there's a body, and then there are feet. Are you guys able to see my mouse cursor while I do this? Okay. In the past, that has sometimes not shown up, which makes it tricky. So the body of the bat, we call the body of the sphenoid. Okay? And if you want to look up these individual terms, we can just click on parts here. And then here is the body of the sphenoid. Everything's going to be highlighted in fuchsia. So that's the body of the sphenoid here. The lesser wing of the sphenoid, right there. And when I say lesser and greater, lesser means smaller and greater means larger. So more anatomical terminology. And in the past, we kind of thought of this as if you wanted to picture taking a little like Lego man and setting him right here on this bat, he would hold on to the lesser wings of the sphenoid. And beneath those, we have the greater wings of the sphenoid. So I'll highlight those in fuchsia. Okay. And he would sit right on this little saddle or seat here. And that's called the sella turcica. So we'd sit in the saddle, the sella turcica of the sphenoid, hold on to these lesser wings, and then be propelled by these greater wings. Okay. Pretty weird analogy, I know, but I think it helps. The feet of the bat would be called the pterygoid processes. Okay. That's an example of how we can use complete anatomy and look at these individual surfaces and parts. And now you're a little bit familiar with the sphenoid and a strange analogy of the bat. Moving on. Okay. So if we peek inside the cranium, we can see it is divided into 3 fossa. Looking at our terminology, we see that a fossa is just a large, shallow depression. So we see 3 of those within the cranium there. And then more of our terminology, we have the anterior fossa, middle fossa, and posterior. So just front, middle, and back shallow depressions within the cranium. Now, also we can see here there are different foramen, or foramina, I guess, plural for holes. And in the past, I used to just walk around the classroom where guys were studying. I had an actual human skull, and I'd come around and point out the different foramen. Since we don't really have that option this year, Jen has prepared a video where she walks through and takes a paperclip and identifies these different holes of the cranium. And in fact, I think I can just pull it up for you quickly. So if you go to your Canvas page, it's right here, it's highlighted in red, Biology 325, Skull Holes Walkthrough. Jen put this together last year. And take a minute and watch that. I think it's really
From
helpful.
a superior view, you can then turn it over and find out where it ends on the inferior side, the underside. Does that make sense? Okay, so starting at the front, actually starting in the eye socket, there is a very round hole at the back of the eye socket that points straight back and exits under, or enters the skull, I guess, under, this would be the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone.
That's right where that little Lego person would sit. And anyway, you can watch that video and take notes. She does a really good job of breaking down the individual foramen and kind of telling a little story as they go. They're really named for, actually, I'll just progress to the next slide because I think I talk about it here. Well, anyway, they're really named for kind of how they look or appear. For example, some of them, there's a foramen lacerum, and you can think of lacerum as a laceration or slash, and it's because that particular foramen looks like a slash, or where something was kind of like a knife was poked through. Okay. Another view here. Probably cleaner within complete anatomy. Same features here, just not colored. Okay. This would be a good slide that you can reference while you're watching Jen's video on those foramen within the skull. As I mentioned, those foramen are named for their appearance or location. Let's take a look at a couple of these. All right. So first we have foramen magnum. Magnum being a large hole. That's what a foramen is. Okay. We have a hypoglossal canal. And really, if we break down this term, hypo means below, and the glossa is your tongue. So this is a canal that runs underneath the tongue. What else do we got? We got the carotid canal. Okay, this is where your carotid artery would move through the skull. Oh, what else do we got here of the foramen? Here's that foramen lacerum. Looks like a laceration or a puncture mark. We have the foramen ovale, and that is because that is oval shaped. Okay. So when you watch that video, Jen does a good job of explaining those to you. Okay. What else on this slide? We can see the palate. And the palate is actually composed of two bones, at least the hard palate. You have the palatine bone, and then you have the palatine process of the maxilla. So it's a process of the maxilla bone, okay? So your kind of upper jaw there, and a process is any projection. It's like a prominence of a bone. Okay? So it's a projection of the maxilla, that second bone. Okay, let's move on. Again, complete anatomy views available with those hyperlinks. Same view, uncolored. All right, moving on to the vertebral column. People always get a little tripped up here because they're worried you have to know the individual numbers of all the vertebrae, right? C1 through L5. And that's not the case. You don't need to know the number of the vertebrae. You just need to know the type, of which there are three. You have cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, and your lumbar vertebrae, right? So it's really not too bad. And in fact, we'll walk through specific characteristics of all three of these types of vertebrae so that you can quickly differentiate between them. Okay. Again, helpful views within complete anatomy. So let's look at kind of a generic vertebrae here. So this isn't a cervical or a lumbar or a thoracic, but just point out a couple points. So we can see here we have a superior articular process. So it helps if we just break these terms down to begin with. So superior, we said, means a top, okay? Meaning on the top. Articular, well, you're probably familiar with that, like in articulation. This is a joint where things move. And then a process, as we just said, is a projection or prominence. So we have this upper articulating prominence. And that's exactly what goes on here. If we look at this superior articular process over here, this is where it is going to interact with a superior vertebrae. So another vertebrae that would be stacked upon it here. Okay? And that's where it's going to articulate or bend at that superior articular process. And in fact, right here, they're not showing it here. There is a facet. So let's see if they point that out for you here, right here. Superior articular facet. And if we flip to our terminology table, we see that a facet is just a shallow depression on a surface. And that's where those two bones are going to come together and articulate. It forms a gliding joint. So you can see these vertebrae stacked one on top of each other, and it allows for bending at that facet where they can glide over one another. So that's a generic vertebrae. We see these transverse processes. Transverse just being off to the side. And process again means a projection. So they just project off to the side, off of this vertebrae. This would be anterior, this would be posterior. This spinous process here, if you run your hand up and down your back, the center of your back, those bumps you're feeling, those are the spinous processes. Okay? And you can see they get a little more prominent in different areas of your back. So let's take a look at that. We'll start with the cervical vertebrae. Cervical meaning neck. Okay. These are easy to identify. So remember I said you had to be able to differentiate between cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. These are probably the easiest because they're the only ones that have these holes here, and they're the transverse foramina. So here's a transverse foramen. Okay. Sorry. So transverse again means to the side. A foramen is a hole. Your cervical vertebrae are the only ones that are going to have that hole there. The other thing that we can point out is this body of the vertebrae here is pretty small, especially when we compare it to a lumbar vertebrae. So it's got this tiny little body, and that's because not much weight supporting your head, but as you get lower down your lumbar region, supporting your whole thoracic trunk plus your head. So we need thicker bodies. And the other thing I'll point out here, which in some instances you can kind of feel this, but we have a bifid spinous process. That just means it has two heads. So if you run your hand along the back of your neck, there are two heads, two processes there. Now I'm actually going to flip, I think within your PowerPoint, it'll move to thoracic vertebrae next, but I'm going to give you some greater contrast and flip to the lumbar vertebrae. And now you're going to notice we have this huge body, right? So these lower vertebrae here, of which there are 5, and really thick body. Okay. The other thing I'm going to point out that is going to help you quickly identify these. Well, the first thing is we're missing those transverse foramen, right? Those are only on the cervical, so we don't have those associated with the lumbar vertebrae. And the other thing is, if you run your hand on your lower back, we have these really flat processes, okay, that are projecting out the back. Okay, so they're not bifid like the cervical were, but they're square and they're flat. So look for a thick body, no foramen, square spinous process. You know you're looking at a lumbar vertebrae. Now we'll go back and revisit the thoracic, which are kind of like a combination of the cervical and the lumbar, but they do have some really definitive characteristics. So the body is kind of an intermediate size and thickness when compared to cervical and lumbar. But what we're going to notice here, one of the defining characteristics is this spinous process, first of all, is pretty sharp. Okay, we can see that here. We have an anterior view, or superior view, I mean. And then from the side, it is angled downward. And that's perhaps the greatest defining characteristic of the thoracic vertebrae. So the others tend to stick out kind of that direction. These are going to be angled downward, the spinous process. Just like the lumbar vertebrae, there are no foramen up here, transverse foramen. Those are only on cervical. And the other thing that kind of differentiates these are these costal facets. So the costa are your ribs, and this is where the rib would articulate with this vertebrae. And the thoracic vertebrae are the only ones that have these costal facets. So those shouldn't be too bad when differentiating between them. All right, so I said you didn't need to know specific vertebrae. Well, I lied. There are two you need to know, but don't worry, they look different from all the others. And they are the C1 and the C2. So C1 being cervical 1 and cervical 2. Okay, so C1 is also known as the atlas. And maybe some of you are familiar with Greek mythology. Atlas was this guy here. Okay. Can't remember what he did, but he was sentenced to hold up the heavens for all of eternity. Okay? So in this case, the heavens are your head. Okay? So this C1 supports the entire head, and we can see that here. So you can think of this as Atlas, this Greek guy, and he's holding up the heavens, which are your head. And we can see where it articulates with the base of the skull right here at these articular facets that allows it to turn. Associated with that, the other one you need to be able to recognize individually is the C2, which we call the axis. Okay? And an axis is a line about which a body rotates. Okay? So this is the vertebrae upon which the atlas sits. So you have C2, and then, which is your axis, and then you have the atlas, which sits upon it and turns, and then upon the atlas, that's holding up your entire head. Okay, so think of it like this. And the distinguishable characteristic of this C2, right, looks a little tricky, but really it's not. If we look at a lateral view and not the superior view, we have this thing here called the dens. So this is going to really help you identify this, and I'll give you a better view here of the C2. Here is that dens. It's this little finger-like projection that sticks up out of the top of the vertebrae, and it allows that atlas to sit upon it and rotate. So we can see that here. There's a ligament that attaches it, and then it allows it to twist about. So look for that dens. If you see that finger-like projection, we're talking about the C2 or the axis. And here they're showing you that C1 or the atlas. And this is where the base of your skull, it would sit right in these facets here and allow turning of the head as well. Okay. And then finally, we have the sacrum and the coccyx. These are pretty easy. I guess the one thing I would make sure you're confident with would be to recognize anterior versus posterior views. So which is the front and which is the back. Okay. So we have the sacrum here. This is the sacrum. And it consists of these fused sacral vertebrae. So you can see we have S1 through S5. You actually don't need to know that, but just be able to recognize the sacrum. And then at the tip of that, the inferior tip, we have the coccyx, or what we call our tailbone. So this is your anterior view. And then if we flip to the next, posterior view. Okay, you have this crest here on the posterior side, which helps you identify front versus back, anterior versus posterior. Really not too bad. And then we'll move on to the thoracic cage. So the thoracic cage includes your 12 thoracic vertebrae. Remember how we said they had those facets where they articulate with the costa, the ribs? So it includes your 12 thoracic vertebrae and the 12 pairs of ribs and the sternum. So the sternum includes the manubrium, top part of the sternum. And this is where, well, first of all, it's where the clavicles would articulate. And we're not seeing the clavicles here, but you guys know your clavicles. So they come out with this. And then we also have our first ribs. So those both articulate off the manubrium, this upper part of the sternum. Okay. And then we have the body of the sternum. And at the very tip, we have this thing called the xiphoid process. And you can probably, if you extend your rib cage here, you can feel your xiphoid process at the tip of the sternum here. Mine's actually completely crooked and sticks off to one side. I think when I was in, it must have been college, putting up a wakeboard tower on a boat, slipped, fell, and it pinned me down and cracked my xiphoid process, and it just healed completely crooked. So I look pretty strange. All right, you don't need to be able to distinguish individual ribs, thankfully. But I think with the ribs, let me flip through my notes. I think you need to be able to, yeah, you do. You have to be able to differentiate right versus left ribs. And that sounds pretty tricky, but I will show you some distinguishing characteristics shortly, which will help you quickly orient yourself to up, down, and then which is associated with the vertebrae and which part is associated with some cartilage. And you also don't need to be able to distinguish individual ribs, but you will need to be able to distinguish true ribs versus false ribs and floating ribs. Okay, so we could show you this image right here, for example, within Complete Anatomy. And we would point to one of these and we would say, is this a true rib? Is this a false rib? Or is this a floating rib? And remember, within Complete Anatomy, we're going to be showing these images and you just have multiple choice answers. This is going to be quite a bit easier, I think, than past years, but I think given the circumstances of block, it'll be a wash. So you don't need to come up with these terms on your own, memorize them and spell them out. You'll have a list of multiple choice answers of which you can choose. I think that'll be helpful. Anyway, back to true ribs. The true ribs, the way we identify those is they all have their own cartilage that leads back to the sternum. Can we see that? So here's the fourth rib, and then it has its own cartilage that leads back to the sternum. Fifth rib, own cartilage. Sixth rib, own cartilage leading back. And the same is true of the seventh rib. And follow that all the way back. Now, where we get false ribs is those cartilages join together and then join up with one of the other cartilages. So for example, the eighth rib here seems to appear to have its own cartilage, but then it joins with the seventh, which leads back to the sternum. So for that reason, these are all false. They don't have their own cartilage that leads back to the sternum. Does that make sense? Okay. Now the floating ribs, those are really easy because they don't have any cartilage associated with them at all. If we were to remove these upper false ribs and true ribs, we'd see the floating ribs back here, and there's no cartilage that leads to anything. They're just false and they project out. Okay. All right. So remember I said you need to be able to differentiate right and left with these. Sounds tricky, but there are landmarks that you can help orient yourself when you're working through this. So the first thing I would do would be to notice the ends of a rib. So on one end, you're going to have kind of this bumpy end. And on the other, you're going to have this smooth surface, okay? Or a flat, smooth surface. Okay? The bumpy end is bumpy because this is where it's going to articulate with the vertebrae. So there's little notches and facets that are going to allow them to wiggle around. The flat end is where it's going to join with, well, here, I'll just put it up for you. They're flat, and you can see that right here. And that's where it's going to come together with that cartilage that goes back to your sternum. Okay? So you know which side is going to be going to the vertebrae by looking at which end of the rib is bumpy with these little processes, facets, and projections. Okay? Then you need to be able to differentiate which side is up versus down in order to be able to tell which side of the body it's on, right versus left. Okay? And to do that, we're going to orient ourselves to this articular facet. That is going to be on the inferior side of that bone. So this is the articular facet for the transverse process of a vertebrae. So remember, we have the vertebrae and they have those projections coming off of the side, the transverse process. Well, it's always going to interact. That rib is going to articulate with that vertebrae beneath it. So for that reason, we look for that on the bottom side of that rib. Okay? So this articular facet will be on the bottom side. So just quickly orient that rib when you look at it. Then you'll know top versus bottom, and you know which side is with the vertebrae by looking at here, vertebrae, and then this will be with cartilage. That's a quick way to orient yourself with these. Let's see here, see if I got anything else. All right, and there is that table. All right, so we got a little bit of time here, like 15 minutes. If you have an individual question about complete anatomy, we can kind of work through that together here, or you are free to take off and I will post this up on Canvas later today for those who want to rewatch or who couldn't make it. So thanks all, and look forward to talking to you soon. If you got questions, stick around.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you guys.
Thank you.
I did have a question.
Sure.
Do you know when we will be able to have access to the room to practice like hands-on material?
To 110.
Yeah.
Man, I wish I could see who's speaking. Is that Faith?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I know Jen just emailed TAs a couple days ago about unpacking the stuff in that room. Our plan is to get it open ASAP because we want it's going to be limited to 6 people in that room just because it's a smaller room and because of distancing. We'll have a sign up on the door, I guess, but really you can just go in there and just keep it under 6 will be the thing. And we're hoping to have that probably unpacked by early next week because I think we were saying it's critical to have a little space where you guys can, if you would like to get that hands-on experience, you can. So, and I'll email Jen again and kind of give an update.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So did you say that all of the questions are going to be like on the practicals kind of multiple choice or choosing? Really? Okay. So you don't have to.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
And then
I was kind of wondering, so I noticed on Complete Anatomy, like when it talks about like the key features and like any anatomical relations, will we need to know that information? Like, will there be questions pertaining to that, or do we just solely need to identify?
Well, that's just kind of helpful information there. You're responsible for identification. just knowing those structures that are upon your list. If it's not on your list, you don't need to know it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else?
3 questions.
Yeah.
In terms of what we were just looking at, identifying right and left ribs, was
Yeah.
that rib a right rib? Can we go
Let
back to it?
me
Because I don't think.
a look. Let's see here. All right, can you see that now?
Mhm.
All right, so this end right here is going to be articulating with the vertebrae, right?
Mhm.
Whereas this is going to be articulating with the cartilage that goes to the sternum. And it's already oriented in the correct direction,
Okay.
as in this facet is pointing downward. So
Mhm.
this would be a right rib.
Okay. And you can imagine it kind of turned the other way. I'm having a hard time seeing it.
Oh, sure. Okay. So I guess they're giving us a posterior view of this right here. So your vertebrae would be right here. And this is wrapping around to the front of the body. And your sternum would be up here. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. It helps
Yep.
me visualize it in my brain.
Yep.
Okay.
So is that like the person's left rib?
That's that
Their-
person's right rib.
Right rib? Okay.
Yep.
So is the bone upside down?
Nope. Nope. See, this articular facet, right? Okay. Here, let me give you a pen. So you would have a vertebrae right here, right? And this would be your back if we're looking at this. This wraps around to the front of the body. Can you see the way that's oriented?
Yeah.
This is pointing downward. So this is the right side of their body. This is the right because they're facing forward.
Oh,
And then this is
okay.
the left.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, that's a tricky image. They probably should have shown an anterior view, but I think they're trying to show off these facets here. So
Oh, I was looking at it with the flat part coming towards us. I didn't realize it was going away. Okay, never mind.
yep,
That's why I was
yep,
really
yep.
confused.
Sure.
Okay, I appreciate that.
No problem.
When we're taking our practicals, will we be able to rotate, rotate what we're looking at to be able to kind
I
of?
think you are, and I think
Okay.
that I can double check with Manny,
Okay.
but I thought that was one of the reasons why we wanted to have these quizzes with incomplete anatomy. We had the option of putting them together within Canvas, but we would have to do screenshots, and then you weren't able to manipulate, I think was the thing. So
Okay.
but I will ask.
I have another question about
Yeah.
complete anatomy. So I
Sure.
was going through the, I guess it's kind of a PowerPoint or a presentation for the axial skeleton.
Yeah.
And there are some parts that would show a slide with like most of the terms that we need to know on it. But I wanted to kind of take that out of the PowerPoint and put it in my own screen and then add the few that I needed more so I could just see like, oh, that's the whole bone and I need to know all these things for that. So is there a way to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad we're still recording because I wanted to show people how to do that. I've gotten a couple emails. So a few of the structures on the structures list haven't made it into complete anatomy yet, but that doesn't mean that you can't find them within complete anatomy. So I'll quickly show you how to do that. And then you can take screenshots if you'd like and just have them with your study materials. Does that sound good? So let's do this. Open complete anatomy. All right, are you seeing that hub there? Okay, so what you can do most of the time you're going to be accessing your slides here within the Atlas or courses, right? If it is not in there, you can go back to your hub. This is called your hub, and just go to models. So click on models, and here in the top right, you can search for anything you want. So for example, oh my gosh, get out of here. I think there was something about the manubrium that didn't show up on your structures list. Okay, so what we can do is just search for, I spelled that wrong. Okay. We can search, and this is going to have everything associated with the manubrium within complete anatomy. And then we can zoom in on that. And this is how you can look for those individual terms that aren't coming up within his slides. Okay. Does that help at all?
Yes. I'm wondering if there's a way though to kind of export his model, like the one in the lecture or the study aid, into your own, like make your own screen from that, and then so you can manipulate it from there.
Yeah, I know that we're not able to do that and share it with other individuals because we didn't spring for that license. It was really expensive. But as far as you as an individual creating your own file, I can double check with Manny. If we're not able to do that, what I would do is probably just take screenshots and put everything into a folder for myself of the material that you'd like. But I can ask him if you can make individual files of slides. That's what you're asking, right? Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question. So, you know the definitions on the structure list, like the packet of structures that we need to know?
Yeah.
Where can I find those definitions?
Let's see. So I guess I'm not completely following. Definitions of your structures?
No, there's like on the second page it has like definitions, and it has like 4 like words there, and then we need to like define them, I think. It's under
Here, I'll share my screen and you can point me where to find this here.
okay.
So this is under structures.
Yeah. And then right there.
Oh, it's dentition. So teeth.
Oh, I thought it said definition.
Yeah.
Oh, dentition. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, sounds
Cool.
good. And that's in
Okay.
complete anatomy?
That's I believe those are in complete anatomy. Yeah. Otherwise, that's a real easy Google search. Your incisors,
Okay.
you have central incisors, the front two, and then the ones next to them are your lateral incisors. Then you have your
Okay.
cuspids, your canines, and then you got premolars and molars. But
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Is that lecture that was with Manny last week Wednesday, was that recorded? For us
it
to go
was.
back? Yeah.
Okay. Did he post that for you guys, or? I think it's up there, right?
He like posted it, and it's like they're like a YouTube link. So like when you click on it in Canvas, it'll like, if your pop-ups are blocked, it'll say like click this to open in a new tab. Otherwise it'll just like open.
Yeah, it's this complete anatomy introduction class.
Okay.
And then it's a YouTube link. And that's exactly what I'm gonna do here. I'm just gonna upload this to YouTube and put a link into Canvas.
Sweet. Thank you.
Yep.
I had one more question. So when we're going through the presentation, is there ever information on that presentation that we aren't actually going to get tested on?
Yeah, I think there are a few. Well, first of all, there's lots of information provided for each structure, which you're not responsible for, right? I mean, it's helpful to understand that structure, but we're strictly asking identification. The other thing you have to look out for is in a few instances, I believe there are structures and surfaces that are not on your structures list. So you wouldn't be responsible for those.
Okay.
So make sure you're just kind of going through that structures list. I print it off and just check off as I go.
Oh, and then, sorry, another question. For the quizzes, I just wanted to clarify, so we can take the quizzes as many times as we want and we get
Right.
the best score, right?
Exactly. So I think ultimately probably you'd score 100% after taking it enough time. So.
Okay, so like I shouldn't be afraid to use that as a study tool.
No.
Like right now. Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Will those quizzes close after the practical, or do the quizzes stay open throughout the whole semester?
I think they're open throughout the whole semester. Yeah, so you could, I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but you could take the practical before taking those quizzes if you wanted to, but.
Every time you take the quiz, do the questions change or are they the same?
I believe they're switched up because they're getting pulled from a quiz bank.
And then I just had one more question about the textbook that you referenced.
Yeah.
I think, is that the like digital access that we have for our class, or was there a separate, I just didn't see it having like a textbook for the lab.
So this is going to be for your lecture series. This is the textbook and some of you have the digital copy. Is that right?
I think so. I think it was like automatic. Like we, yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Yep.
Okay.
Anything else? All right. Well, thanks for sticking around and answering the important question or asking the important questions. So.
Thank you.
Yep. We'll see you guys
Thank you.
week
Thank
unless I hear
you.
from you sooner. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.